Hello there, my name is Dr. Ryan Galloway and I'm from Stanford University and I'm here to talk to you about the AI Interoperability Affirmative. So I wanted to write an affirmative on artificial intelligence because I knew that the packet affirmative was going to be about cybersecurity and I wanted to give you a different technology to look at. And I think you'll find that if you like big stick affirmatives with lots of advantages, that you'll really like the AI Interoperability Affirmative. So I'm going to talk about the plan. I'm going to talk about AFF advantages. I'm going to talk about the add-ons that you can run or potential AFF advantages you can claim in the 1AC. I'm going to talk about the disadd answers to the affirmative, and I'm going to talk about how this affirmative answers some counterplans which I think will be popular on the topic. So let's begin. The plan says the United States federal government should substantially increase security cooperation with NATO by establishing standards to interoperate artificial intelligence technology into future NATO operations. Now I'm going to go over a few terms in this plan that will be unfamiliar to you, but we're going to start by talking about what kind of AI is used by NATO. In other words, when we talk about artificial intelligence in the context of the affirmative, what are we talking about? And the first is embedding artificial intelligence into already existing weapons, into tracking systems, into reconnaissance systems, into early warning systems, etc. One of the things you'll find with the affirmative is that there's a lot talked about integrating AI into nuclear weapons technology, into making sure we can have early warning of attacks from other nations, making sure that we can separate the wheat from the chaff. In other words, we can know what's really going on and we don't accidentally respond to a false alarm, as has happened in multiple times. But this can be done with any kind of weapon. It can be done with missile systems, it can be done with planes, it can be done with ground vehicles, etc., to help tracking the enemy, to help give recon on where enemy troops are, and to help do early warning if we're about to be attacked. AI can also work positively with cybersecurity. The AI system can protect networks, computers, programs, etc. It can detect when a threat is coming. It begins to shut down programs that are being under attack, etc. And it doesn't have to rely on humans and our slow brains figuring out where there's a threat and what to do about that threat. Logistics and transportation. You can see some of the vehicles in the back here that AI can help with coordinating where those vehicles can go, coordinating how to get military weaponry to various places, how to get supplies to troops, etc. It can also be used in combat simulation and training, so the AI can be the opponent on the battlefield that helps train troops how to respond in given situations. The AI can do threat monitoring and surveillance. You're probably familiar with drones, and the drones can go out over the battlefield and surveil the battlefield and determine where threats are coming from, etc. And data and information processing. AI is a lot more efficient than humans at dealing with large amounts of data and information, and so AI is a lot more efficient and effective than humans being in charge of trying to deal with the massive amount of data that comes from a modern battlefield. The second question you might have, what does it mean to make AI interoperable? That's what the plan does. What does that mean? And interoperability means the ability to act together effectively. In other words, it coordinates the technologies that NATO will use on the battlefield and makes it to where throughout NATO operations we use AI. Right now, different NATO countries have different standards on what AI systems are acceptable, how they use them, etc. The plan would work with NATO to come up with a standard by which we establish which AI technologies and how AI technologies will be used throughout NATO operations in the future. And integration would require agreement on standards for AI. I think the evidence is pretty good that says that NATO standards will create effective control for the future, that NATO standards create a precedent for artificial intelligence, and that NATO standards will spill out to artificial intelligence control in non-NATO operations. So we project NATO's ability to interoperate in future operations. We say in future operations, these are the standards for AI. All of NATO should use the same kind of artificial intelligence in order to have future battlefield operations, and it requires cooperation among NATO to get there. The first advantage in the affirmative is AI leadership. We say that China is winning the AI arms race now. China is taking artificial intelligence very seriously. China is investing a lot in artificial intelligence, and they're going to be the world leader in artificial intelligence technology now. This would lead to Chinese leadership and threats to the liberal international order. So the evidence is very good that says whoever controls AI will be the world leader. And right now we have what's called the liberal international order, which is a Western focused control of the international system. We have things like the United Nations, we have things like the WTO, we have things like the IMF and the World Bank that allow the Western nations to largely construct an international order that believes in freedom, that believes in democracy, etc. If China was in the lead, the international order would be very different. It would be more authoritarian, it would be more top-down, it would be an Eastern-oriented model to where democracy would not be accepted as the prevailing norm. Those threats to the liberal international order risk a nuclear conflict with China. It threatens U.S. hegemony because the liberal international order is critical to U.S. leadership, and common standards with NATO are key to maintaining our edge. We need a common standard with NATO for artificial intelligence in order to compete with China. The evidence is pretty good that says you need NATO to do this as well, that domestic AI building up and domestic AI research is inadequate to solve this advantage, and that NATO brings a lot of unique characteristics with its resources, with its leadership, with its scientists that are critical to maintaining an edge. And that's important because when you think about choosing your affirmative on this topic, you're going to want to know how to answer a couple of different counterplans. One you're going to want to know how to answer is the unilateral counterplan or the domestic counterplan. Just have the United States research into whatever the technology is that the affirmative uses. And the second counterplan you're going to want to have answers to is to do it with someone other than NATO, like the EU. In my research on this topic, I found probably more evidence that says we should cooperate with the EU on emerging technologies and not NATO, and then whatever NATO cooperation disadvantage you have, like a Russia disadvantage or a securitization critique, can be your net benefit to that counterplan. Fortunately, I think this affirmative has a pretty good defense against those counterplans because the NATO key evidence is pretty good. The next advantage is conflict resolution. NATO coordination prevents accidents. This is the integration of the technology into NATO operations. Artificial intelligence technology allows for better early warning, allows for better surveillance, allows for better information gathering from people on the battlefield so we don't accidentally go to conflict, especially a nuclear conflict. And it allows for de-escalation. It bolsters international arms control because it allows for superior verification. So a lot of nations don't want to go along with arms control because they're worried about intrusive verification regimes, like having boots on the ground, people physically inspecting plants. But if AI can do that instead, then people are more willing to go along with arms control. Nations like Russia, nations like China, nations like India and Pakistan, nations like North Korea, etc. And arms control stops multiple scenarios for conflict. The evidence on this is pretty good, that we've largely given up on arms control in the present system, and that nuclear technology is largely out of control. and we need to reinstantiate arms control into our international agenda. Integrating AI into nuclear weapon systems enhances crisis stability. We know better what's going on. We can have better early warning system. We can better determine whether the blips on the screen are actually geese or are nuclear weapons, so we don't respond inadvertently. And history is replete with examples of both the United States and the Soviet Union at the time almost responding accidentally to conflict scenarios where they almost used nuclear weapons. I'm sure you're familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis from your history classes, and there are a lot of other examples where we've come very close to nuclear conflict because we had bad information. Also, it bolsters cybersecurity because it can predict and respond to cyber threats. The AI is smarter than human technology. The AI is faster than human technology. The AI can predict what is being targeted and respond to those cyber threats appropriately. And of course, cyber warfare goes nuclear. I would think you would want to claim this as a relatively small advantage to an AI affirmative because obviously you're trying to distinguish your affirmative from other technologies. And given that a lot of people will run cybersecurity AFFs on this topic, you probably want this to be a small part of your advantage. Solvency for the affirmative is that interoperability bolsters AI production by setting standards. The evidence says that NATO standards are the gold standard for international standards, and you need the NATO operations in order to do this. That NATO standards prevent Chinese AI dominance. There's good evidence that says NATO as a whole needs to take up the challenge of Chinese AI dominance, which helps to answer the domestic counterplan that people will run. That common ground among NATO ensures global tech leadership, that we need all of NATO fighting this battle against China. It's inadequate to just have the United States involved. We need everyone involved. That NATO standards spill over to non-NATO operations. I was kind of surprised to find this evidence, but it was talking about detention policy and the analogy to artificial intelligence that says when NATO sets a standard on something, it will spill over to non-NATO operations, so you can solve for AI in the civilian sector as well. And NATO cooperation sets precedents for the future. This is a big stick affirmative. In other words, you can claim a lot of advantages with this affirmative. I've chosen the two advantages that I chose to the affirmative because I thought they had the biggest impacts and they were the best solved for by the affirmative, but you're not limited to just those. Not only could you build in these advantages into the 1AC, you could read them as add-ons in the 2AC to increase the amount of pressure you put on the negative in the negative block. The first is democracy, that NATO control allows Western values in artificial intelligence to predominate. And so China wants to use artificial intelligence to enhance authoritarian control, to better surveil the population. You all who debated the criminal justice topic are probably familiar with what China was doing with facial recognition technology in order to better control the population. But if NATO and the West control this technology, we'll have better democratic norms. And the evidence is very good from democratic peace theorists that say the expansion of democracy is necessary to provide for peace in the world. You can also claim an advantage just on NATO, that leadership in advanced tech bolsters NATO operations. I've talked a lot earlier about how integrating artificial intelligence into the military will bolster military readiness, will make the military stronger, and thus NATO will be a better, more flexible, stronger organization into the future, and that NATO is necessary to stop widespread conflicts. I was also surprised to find evidence on North Korea that artificial intelligence can bolster arms control with North Korea. It's a particular spin-off of the arms control advantage. If you wanted to run that under your conflict resolution advantage as a scenario, you could run North Korea. And the evidence is very good that says North Korea maintaining its nuclear arsenal is a bad idea. And pandemics. If you can win the spillover to the civilian sector, AI allows faster solutions to pandemics. We've already seen what the problem with pandemics is with the COVID crisis, and there's good evidence that says the next pandemic will lead to human extinction. I also think there are good disad answers with this affirmative. The first is the politics disad. The plan is popular because people recognize the need to cooperate over AI. American leaders, Congress, they understand that artificial intelligence is important and significant, and we need to cooperate with our allies over artificial intelligence in order to stop China. So your plan has good reason why it's bipartisan and why it's popular. Probably the disad that most people will think of intuitively when they think of this affirmative is to just say that AI is bad. And there's good evidence citing people like Elon Musk and citing people like Bill Gates and citing people like Stephen Hawking, which says the continued advancement of artificial intelligence threatens human extinction because it will get out of control. But remember that artificial intelligence is inevitable. It will happen either with China winning the race or with the US and NATO winning the race. If the US and NATO win that race, they can create effective standards over AI that prevent it from getting out of control. There's also an ethics bad disadvantage that says that if we have ethical standards on AI and we restrain ourselves from using and investigating particular technologies under AI, that could hold the West back and that China and Russia and other nations will not have those same ethical stances. However, I think the evidence is pretty good that says that adopting an ethical stance on artificial intelligence will actually bolster the willingness of nations to fund and support AI. And so it's better to look ethical while you do this, even if you restrain yourself from certain AI applications. I think that this affirmative has good answers to the common counterplans on the topic. And there are three I think you need to be prepared for. The first is the domestic counterplan or unilateral counterplan, where the U.S. researches and develops the technology on their own. The evidence here is pretty good. It says cooperation with NATO is necessary to win the AI race against China because China is ahead, China is pushing its advances as quickly as it can, and the U.S. cannot win this race alone. As for the non-NATO counterplans, like the EU counterplan, which I think you should definitely be prepared for, cooperate with some organization other than NATO, be it the EU, be it the UN, some other organization other than NATO, with a NATO bad disadvantage as the net benefit to that counterplan. There's good evidence that NATO is the standard setter on military technology and is key to establishing leadership. So that gives you an angle against people saying, well, we ought to cooperate internationally, but we just don't need to cooperate with NATO because we could cooperate civilly with the EU. Another counterplan could be coordinating with the private sector to not have the U.S. federal government do the coordination, but have NGOs or private actors be of the primary responsibility to cooperate with NATO. But government support is needed for AI because it's so big and it's so advanced. So here are my reasons why you might want to consider running this AFF. The first is it has big advantages. If you are a faster team that likes to pressure your opponents, then this affirmative is for you. You have advantages all over the globe. You have big nuclear advantages that can outweigh the disads to the affirmative. The second is you have lots of add-ons so you can run and gun against negative teams. you can read an add-on to solve just about any disad that they run because you claim to advance artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence has so many applications that you can claim to solve just about anything. The third is it has non-Russia advantages. So I can see a lot of debates come down to the question of Russia and whether or not the plan better deals with Russia than the other team. And those debates are going to be messy and hard for judges to decide. Does the plan better deter Russia? Does the plan anger Russia, etc.? But you can say if the debate on Russia is close, we have a China advantage, we have an arms control advantage, we have advantages that deal with other spheres than Russia, and so you can claim to win the debate on the tiebreaker. And the other thing is it has good answers to non-NATO counterplans. I think a standard that is basic that you need to overcome on this topic, sort of a litmus test for affirmatives on this topic is, can you answer the unilateral counterplan, and can you answer the cooperate with non-NATO nations counterplan? And I think this affirmative has answers to those types of advantages. So if you're a team that likes a big affirmative, that likes big advantages, and likes to outweigh what the other team has to say, then I think this is a good affirmative for you to run. Thank you, and I hope you have a good season.